She sat in silence at the back until the instructor struck. First document. The Galactic Military Academy stood like a crystal spear against the purple sky of Nexus Prime, its gleaming walls reflecting the light of 3 suns. Inside the massive structure, thousands of beings from across the galaxy gathered to learn the art of war, diplomacy, and survival in the vast emptiness of space. In Classroom 7 Delta, 83 students sat in perfectly arranged rows, their various forms creating a rainbow of alien physiology. There were the towering Kreks with their 4 arms and metallic skin, the insect-like Vorthak clicking their mandibles in nervous anticipation, and the graceful Etherians floating slightly above their seats with translucent wings shimmering behind them. At the very back of the room, in the corner seat where shadows gathered deepest, sat a small figure that most barely noticed. Maya Chen appeared unremarkable compared to her classmates. No extra limbs, no natural armor, no telepathic abilities that made the air shimmer around her head. She was human, and humans were still considered the newcomers to galactic civilization. The other students whispered among themselves in dozens of languages, their conversations creating a symphony of alien sounds. They spoke of their homeworlds, their families' military traditions, and their expectations for the advanced combat tactics course they were about to begin. Maya listened to everything, understanding more than they realized thanks to the translation implant behind her ear. But she said nothing. Instructor Vextar entered the room like a storm given form. The Draknari stood nearly 3 meters tall, his reptilian features marked by scars that spoke of countless battles across the galaxy. His scales were deep emerald green, darkening to black along the ridge of his spine, and his yellow eyes swept across the room with predatory intelligence. When he moved, students could hear the soft whisper of his tail dragging across the floor behind him. "Welcome to Advanced Combat Tactics." His voice rumbled through the room like distant thunder. "I am Instructor Vextar, veteran of the Outer Rim Wars, survivor of the Siege of Kronos 7, and your guide through the next 6 months of your military education." The students straightened in their seats, some species showing respect through different postures. The Kreks locked their 4 arms behind their backs, while the Etherians dimmed their natural glow to show attention. "In this course you will learn how real warriors fight," Vextar continued, his gaze moving slowly across each row. "Not the pretty formations they teach in basic training, not the theoretical battles you study in history class. You will learn how to kill or be killed, how to lead troops into the fires of hell, and how to make decisions that will save or damn entire star systems." His eyes finally reached the back corner where Maya sat. For a moment, his predatory gaze lingered on her small form, taking in her plain military uniform, her unremarkable appearance, her complete stillness. A slight smile played at the corners of his mouth, revealing teeth designed for tearing flesh. "This galaxy is a dangerous place," Vextar said, though his eyes remained fixed on Maya. "Every species has evolved different strengths to survive. The Kreks have their 4 arms and metallic skin that can deflect energy blasts. The Vorthak have their hive-mind connection and natural armor plating. The Etherians have telepathic abilities that let them coordinate without speaking." He began walking between the rows, his massive form casting shadows over the students as he passed. "Each of you brings something unique to the art of warfare. Something that has kept your species alive long enough to reach the stars." The instructor stopped directly in front of Maya's row, though he was still several seats away from her. "But some species," he continued, his voice taking on a mocking tone, "some species are unremarkable. They have no natural weapons, no armor, no special abilities. They are soft, weak, and utterly dependent on their technology to survive." A few students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Everyone knew he was talking about humans, though he hadn't said the word directly. Maya remained perfectly still, her dark eyes focused straight ahead, her breathing calm and steady. These species often wonder how they survived long enough to develop spaceflight, Vextar went on, beginning to pace again. After all, the galaxy is full of predators. How does prey become predator? How does the weak become strong enough to claim a place among the stars? A Krek student named Thorak raised one of his 4 hands. Instructor, surely every species that reaches space travel must have some advantage? Some evolutionary trait that helped them survive? Vextar's laugh was like gravel in a blender. An interesting theory, Cadet Thorak. But consider this. What if a species' only advantage was that they were too insignificant for predators to notice? What if they hid in caves and holes until the real hunters moved on to bigger prey? The insult hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Every being in the room understood the implication, and many eyes turned toward Maya. She was the only human in the class, the only representative of her species. Yet she showed no reaction to the instructor's words, no anger or embarrassment. She simply sat in her corner seat, hands folded in her lap, waiting. "Today we begin with the basics," Vexitar announced, moving toward the front of the room where a holographic display system waited. "Combat scenarios that have decided the fate of civilizations. We will examine the Battle of Zerion Nebula, where superior strategy overcame overwhelming numbers." The lights dimmed, and the air above the students' heads came alive with 3-dimensional images. Ships of war materialized in perfect detail, their hulls scarred by battle, their weapons glowing with deadly energy. The Draknari instructor's voice filled the darkness as he began to describe the conflict that had shaped modern galactic politics. Maya watched the battle unfold in the holographic display, but part of her attention remained on Instructor Vextar. She had read his file before arriving at the academy, just as she had read the files of all her instructors. She knew about his military service, his combat record, his teaching methods. She knew that he had a reputation for being particularly harsh toward species he considered inferior. What Vextar didn't know was that Maya had also read the after-action reports from his military service. She knew about the tactical mistakes that had cost lives, the poor decisions disguised by official commendations, the way he had built his reputation by taking credit for other officers' successes. She knew all of this, but she said nothing. The battle scenario played out above their heads, ships dancing through space in patterns of death and destruction. Vexitar paused the display at crucial moments to explain tactical decisions, to point out where commanders had succeeded or failed. His knowledge was extensive, his analysis sharp, but Maya noticed the subtle ways he edited the truth to make himself appear more competent. "Observe how Admiral Theknor positions his heavy cruisers," Vextar said, pointing to the holographic fleet. "A brilliant maneuver that saved the entire battle group from destruction. Of course, I was serving as his tactical advisor at the time." Maya knew that Vextar had been a junior communications officer during that battle, nowhere near the command structure. She knew that Admiral Theknor had specifically mentioned in his reports that several of his junior officers had panicked during the engagement, but she said nothing. As the class period continued, other students began to participate in the discussion. They asked questions about fleet formations, weapon effectiveness, and strategic doctrine. Several showed impressive knowledge of military history and theory. The instructor seemed pleased with their engagement, praising their insights and encouraging further questions. But his eyes kept returning to the back corner, where Maya sat in silence. "Cadet," he said suddenly, his voice cutting through the discussion like a blade. The holographic display froze in the middle of an orbital bombardment sequence. "Cadet Chen." Maya looked up calmly, meeting his predatory gaze without flinching. "Yes, Instructor? You've been remarkably quiet during this discussion. Perhaps humans have nothing to contribute to the study of military tactics." The room fell silent. Even the soft humming of the environmental system seemed to fade as 82 alien faces turned toward the small human in the corner. Maya felt the weight of their stares, the mixture of curiosity and pity in their expressions. Most expected her to stammer an excuse or apologize for her silence. Instead, she simply said, "I've been listening." Instructor. "Listening," Vextar repeated, tasting the word like something sour. "How remarkably passive. Tell me, Cadet Chen, what did you think of Admiral Theknor's tactical brilliance in the Zirion engagement?" Maya was quiet for a long moment, considering her response. She could feel the tension in the room, the expectation that she would either embarrass herself with ignorance or challenge the instructor's version of events. Either response would give Vexitar what he wanted, an excuse to humiliate her in front of the class. The Admiral made the best decisions available with the information he had, she said finally. Given the circumstances, his strategy was sound. It was a careful, diplomatic answer that said nothing while appearing to say something. Vexitar's smile widened, showing more of his predatory teeth. "How wonderfully neutral," he purred. "Tell me, do humans always avoid taking positions on important matters? Or is this particular to military strategy?" Another trap, Maya realized. He was trying to goad her into either defending her species or criticizing them. Either response would give him ammunition to use against her. "I prefer to understand a situation completely before forming judgments," she said simply. "Understanding," Vextar mused, beginning to pace toward her corner of the room. Such a human concept. While warriors act, humans want to understand. While predators strike, humans want to analyze. He was getting closer, his massive form casting a growing shadow over her desk. "Tell me, Cadet Chen, how did your species survive long enough to develop this love of understanding? What kept the predators away while you were busy thinking?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Maya could feel the collective attention of the class focused on her, waiting to see how the small human would respond to the Draknari's provocation. She remained perfectly still, her hands folded, her breathing steady. "We adapted," she said quietly. "Adapted," Vextar laughed, the sound echoing off the classroom walls. "Such a delightfully vague term. The Kreks adapted by growing armor and extra limbs. The Vorthak adapted by developing hive intelligence. How exactly did humans adapt? What great evolutionary leap gave you the strength to reach the stars?" Maya looked up at the towering instructor, her dark eyes calm and steady. For just a moment, something flickered in her gaze. Not fear or anger, but something deeper and more primal. Something that made Vextar's predatory smile falter for just an instant. "We learned to be very, very patient," she said. The words were spoken softly, almost conversationally, but something in her tone made the temperature in the room seem to drop several degrees. The other students shifted uncomfortably, though none could say exactly why. Vextar stared down at the small human, his yellow eyes searching her face for some sign of weakness or fear. He found none. "Patience," he said finally, his voice slightly less confident than before. "An interesting adaptation. We'll see how patient you can be over the next 6 months, Cadet Chen." He turned away from her then, moving back toward the front of the room to resume the holographic battle display. But Maya noticed that he didn't turn his back completely to her corner of the room. Some ancient instinct, buried deep in his predatory brain, whispered warnings that he didn't quite understand. The class continued for another hour, covering tactical formations and strategic doctrines that had shaped galactic warfare for centuries. Students asked questions and offered insights, gradually returning to the normal rhythm of academic discussion. But the tension lingered in the air like smoke, and more than one alien glanced nervously toward the quiet human in the back corner. When the period finally ended and students began gathering their materials, Maya remained seated until the room had mostly emptied. Only then did she rise, moving with an economy of motion that was both graceful and somehow unsettling. As she passed Instructor Vexitar's desk on her way to the door, he looked up from his notes. "Cadet Chen," he said, his voice deceptively casual. "I expect all students to participate actively in class discussions. Silence is not an option in my course." Maya paused, turning to face him with that same calm expression. "Understood, Instructor." "Good." Vexitar nodded, pleased that he had apparently re-established his dominance. "I look forward to hearing your contributions to our next class." "I'm sure you will," Maya replied quietly, and something in her tone made the instructor look up sharply. But her expression remained perfectly neutral, respectful even. She walked toward the door, her footsteps silent on the classroom floor. Just before reaching the exit, she paused and turned back. "Instructor?" "Yes." "Cadet?" "You mentioned that you served as Admiral Theknor's tactical advisor during the Zerion engagement." Vextar's posture straightened, his chest swelling with pride. "That's correct. Why do you ask?" Maya was quiet for a moment, as if considering her words carefully. "I was just wondering, didn't Admiral Theknor die at the Battle of Kronos 7? The same battle you mentioned surviving?" The question hit the room like a physical blow. Vexitar's expression froze, his yellow eyes widening as he realized the implication. If he had been Theknor's tactical advisor, and if he had survived Kronos 7 while the Admiral died, then certain uncomfortable questions arose about his conduct during that battle. "The Admiral died heroically," Vextar said slowly, his voice carefully controlled. "As did many brave warriors." "Of course," Maya nodded respectfully. "I just thought it was interesting that you served with him twice. At Zerion as his tactical advisor, and then later at Kronos 7. That must have been difficult." The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Vextar realized that this small, quiet human had somehow managed to research his military record in detail. She knew things that weren't in the public files, things that could damage his reputation if they were examined too closely. "War is always difficult, Cadet," he said finally. "Yes," Maya agreed softly, "especially for those who survive when others don't." And with that, she walked out of the classroom, leaving Instructor Vextar alone with his thoughts and the uncomfortable realization that the quiet human in the back corner might be far more dangerous than she appeared. She sat in silence at the back until the instructor struck. Second document. The weeks that followed Maya's first encounter with Instructor Vextar settled into an uncomfortable pattern. Each class period began the same way, students filing into the room, taking their assigned seats, while Maya claimed her corner position in the back row. The Draknari instructor would arrive with his usual dramatic flair, ready to share his version of galactic military history with students eager to prove themselves worthy of command. But now there was an undercurrent of tension that hadn't existed before. Vexitar found himself glancing toward the back corner more frequently than he liked, searching for some sign that the quiet human was preparing to challenge him again. Maya, for her part, maintained her pattern of silent attention, taking notes in a small electronic pad while her classmates participated in discussions. The dynamic between them had shifted in ways that neither fully acknowledged. Vextar no longer singled out Maya for direct mockery, though his comments about lesser species and evolutionary failures continued with regularity. He had learned to be more careful about his claims of military glory, subtly adjusting his stories to make them harder to fact-check. Maya observed these changes without comment, filing away each modification as another piece of data about her instructor's psychology. She was beginning to understand that Vextar's hostility toward humans wasn't just casual prejudice. It was fear disguised as contempt. He was afraid of being exposed, afraid that his carefully constructed reputation would crumble if examined too closely. During their third week, the class began studying the infamous siege of Kepler Station, a battle that had lasted for 18 months and claimed over 2 million lives. Vextar activated the holographic display with obvious enthusiasm, filling the air above their heads with images of a massive space station surrounded by the wrecks of countless ships. Kepler Station was considered impregnable, he began, his voice taking on the practiced cadence of a storyteller. Built by the Terran Federation in the early days of human expansion, it guarded one of the most important hyperspace routes in the galaxy. When the Zephyrian Empire decided to claim that route for themselves, they learned why humans had survived long enough to build such fortresses. Maya's head came up slightly at the mention of humans, though her expression remained neutral. Around the room, other students leaned forward with interest. Human military engineering was respected throughout the galaxy, even if humans themselves were often dismissed as weak. The siege lasted 18 standard months, Vextar continued, manipulating the holographic display to show the massive Zephyrian fleet surrounding the station. Wave after wave of attackers crashed against the station's defenses like ocean waves against a cliff. The humans inside refused every offer of surrender, every chance for honorable defeat. The instructor paused the display at a moment when the station's defense grid was firing at maximum capacity, energy beams lancing out to destroy attacking ships. But eventually, even the strongest fortress can be worn down. The Zephyrians brought up their planet-killer weapons, massive beam cannons that could crack the station's hull like an eggshell. He zoomed the display in to show damage to the station's outer rings, sections that had been blasted away by the enemy's heaviest weapons. At this point, any rational commander would have surrendered. The station was doomed. The defenders outnumbered 1,000 to 1. Continuing to fight would only result in needless deaths. Vextar's yellow eyes swept across the classroom, making sure he had everyone's attention. But humans, as we have discussed, are not always rational. Instead of surrendering, Station Commander Williams made a decision that violated every principle of civilized warfare. The holographic display shifted to show the station's interior, revealing corridors packed with civilian refugees who had been trapped when the siege began. Williams opened the station's docking bays and began evacuating civilians in small, unarmed ships. He used his military vessels as shields, sacrificing warships to protect refugee transports. A Vorthak student clicked her mandibles in confusion. Instructor, surely protecting civilians is a basic principle of military conduct. Under normal circumstances, yes, Vextar agreed. But Williams went far beyond normal protective measures. He ordered his crew to manually detonate the station's reactor core, creating an explosion that would destroy the entire Zephyrian fleet. The room fell silent as students processed the implications. Thorak, the Krex cadet, raised one of his 4 hands. A suicide attack? That seems extreme. Exactly. Vextar nodded approvingly. Williams condemned his entire crew to death rather than accept honorable defeat. Over 3,000 military personnel died in that explosion, along with nearly 1 million Zephyrian attackers. The instructor manipulated the display to show the moment of detonation, an expanding sphere of destruction that consumed both the station and the surrounding enemy fleet. It was a massacre disguised as heroism, a war crime that human propagandists have spent decades trying to justify. Maya's hand moved slightly on her electronic pad, but she didn't look up from her notes. Around the room, students shifted uncomfortably as they tried to reconcile their respect for human engineering with this story of seemingly senseless destruction. The worst part, Vexatar continued, his voice heavy with disgust, was that Williams recorded a message before the detonation. He claimed that he was teaching the galaxy an important lesson about human nature. The instructor's smile was cold and predatory. He said that humans would always choose mutual destruction over submission, that any species trying to conquer humanity should remember Kepler Station. A young Etherian named Lisa spoke up, her voice barely above a whisper. What happened to the civilians? The refugees in the transport ships? Most escaped, Vextar admitted reluctantly. The explosion created enough chaos for them to reach friendly territory. But that doesn't justify Williams's actions. A proper military commander would have found a way to save both the civilians and his crew. The holographic display faded, leaving the room in normal lighting. Vextar stood at the front of the class, hands clasped behind his back, waiting for questions or comments. Several students looked like they wanted to speak, but uncertainty held them back. I find it interesting, Maya said quietly, her voice carrying clearly in the silence, that you describe the station's destruction as a war crime. All eyes turned toward her corner of the room. Vextar's expression hardened, his predatory smile returning. And what would you call it, Cadet Chen, when a commander deliberately kills his own crew? Maya looked up from her notes, meeting his gaze with calm directness. I would call it following the Galactic Warfare Convention, Section 12, Subsection 4. Military commanders have the right to destroy their own installations to prevent them from falling into enemy hands. The convention assumes the crew volunteers for such actions, Vextar countered. Williams gave no one a choice. Actually, Maya said, her voice still quiet and respectful. According to the station's communication logs, Commander Williams asked for volunteers for a rearguard action. Every member of his crew volunteered to stay behind. The silence in the room became deafening. Vextar stared at the small human, his yellow eyes narrowing. You seem remarkably well informed about historical details, Cadet. I read the original source documents before class, Maya replied simply. Commander Williams's final message wasn't propaganda. It was a warning to anyone who thought humans could be easily conquered. A warning, Vextar repeated, his voice dripping with sarcasm. How typically human to disguise cowardice as courage. Cowardice? Maya's tone remained calm, but something subtle shifted in her posture. Commander Williams stayed on a doomed station to save civilians he'd never met. His crew volunteered to die rather than abandon innocent people. In what way was that cowardly? They chose death over the possibility of captivity, Vextar snarled, his composure finally cracking. Rather than face the consequences of defeat, they took the easy way out. Maya was quiet for a long moment, considering his words. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. But every being in the room heard her clearly. Instructor, have you ever been in a situation where you had to choose between your life and your principles? The question hit Vextar like a physical blow. Images flashed through his mind. The command deck of a dying ship, Admiral Theknor ordering him to coordinate the evacuation while the Admiral remained behind to buy them time. The moment when Vextar had abandoned his post and fled to the escape pods, leaving his commander to die alone. That is not relevant to this discussion, he said, his voice strained. Isn't it? Maya asked gently. You said that Williams and his crew chose death over captivity. But what if they weren't choosing death? What if they were choosing something else entirely? Enlighten us, Vextar growled, though his confidence was clearly shaken. Maya stood up slowly, her movement drawing every eye in the room. For the first time since classes began, she stepped away from her corner seat, walking to the front of the room where the holographic display controls waited. May I, Instructor? Vextar wanted to refuse, but with 82 students watching, he couldn't appear weak. He nodded curtly, stepping aside as Maya activated the display system. The air above their heads filled with star charts and tactical data, but Maya didn't show them the Battle of Kepler Station. Instead, she displayed a simple graph showing population statistics across human-controlled space. Before the siege of Kepler Station, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the room. Human settlements were scattered and vulnerable. Individual colonies could be picked off one by one, their populations enslaved or exterminated without effective resistance. She manipulated the display to show attack patterns, red lines indicating successful raids against human outposts. The Zephyrian Empire had been doing exactly that for 3 years, testing human resolve and finding it lacking. They believed humans would surrender rather than face total war. The display shifted to show the hyperspace routes around Kepler Station, highlighting its strategic importance. But Commander Williams understood something that the Zephyrians didn't. He knew that humans weren't fighting for territory or resources. They were fighting for the right to exist. Maya's fingers moved across the holographic controls, showing the moment of the station's destruction from a different perspective. Instead of focusing on the explosion itself, she showed the aftermath: Zephyrian retreat, failed offensive operations, and a fundamental shift in galactic politics. After Kepler Station, no species in the galaxy believed that humans could be easily conquered, she said quietly. The message wasn't that humans preferred death to captivity. The message was that humans would make conquest so expensive that nobody would try. The room was absolutely silent. Even Vextar stood frozen, staring at the holographic display as Maya continued her analysis. Commander Williams didn't choose death over life, she said. He chose the future of his species over his present comfort. Every human who died at Kepler Station saved thousands of others who would never have to face the same choice. She turned off the display and returned to face the class, her expression calm and professional. That's not cowardice, Instructor. That's strategy. Vextar felt the weight of 82 pairs of eyes on him, waiting for his response to Maya's analysis. He could see the respect in their faces, the way they looked at the quiet human who had just delivered a masterful tactical briefing. His authority in the classroom was slipping away like sand through his claws. An interesting interpretation, he managed to say, though his voice sounded hollow even to himself. But it doesn't change the fact that— Instructor, Maya interrupted gently, and the simple fact that she had cut him off sent a shockwave through the room. May I ask you a question? Vexitar wanted to refuse, but he could feel the class watching his every reaction. Proceed, he said through gritted teeth. During the Battle of Kronos 7, when Admiral Theknor gave the order to evacuate the command ship, what was your primary responsibility? The question hit Vextar like a plasma bolt to the chest. His yellow eyes widened in shock and fear as he realized that Maya knew. Somehow, this small human had accessed classified military records and learned the truth about his greatest shame. That information is classified, he stammered. The basic facts are public record, Maya said calmly. Admiral Theknor died when his command ship was destroyed by enemy fire. Most of his senior staff died with him, but you survived, along with several junior officers who were evacuated before the final battle. The room was so quiet that the sound of Vextar's breathing was clearly audible. Every student leaned forward, sensing that something significant was happening, but not understanding exactly what. The Admiral ordered the evacuation, Vextar said weakly. He commanded us to leave. Yes, Maya agreed. He ordered junior personnel to evacuate while senior officers remained to coordinate the final defense. Your duty, as his tactical advisor, was to stay with him until the end. The truth hung in the air like a sword waiting to fall. Vextar's carefully constructed reputation, his claims of heroism and military excellence, all of it balanced on the edge of exposure. The students might not understand the full implications yet, but they could see their instructor's confidence crumbling. I followed orders, Vextar whispered. Whose orders? Maya asked softly. Admiral Theknor's order to evacuate junior personnel, or his order for senior staff to remain at their posts? Vextar's mouth opened and closed silently, like a fish gasping for air. He had built his entire career on the assumption that no one would ever examine his service record closely enough to discover the truth. He was a coward who had abandoned his post, a survivor who had let better beings die in his place. Maya watched his internal struggle with something that might have been pity. "The difference between Commander Williams and other officers," she said quietly, "is that Williams chose his duty over his survival. He understood that some things are more important than living." She walked slowly back toward her corner seat, but paused halfway there to deliver her final words. "You've spent weeks telling us that humans are weak because we lack natural weapons or armor. But you're wrong, Instructor. Our strength isn't in our bodies. It's in our willingness to sacrifice everything for the things we believe in. That's why we survived long enough to reach the stars. That's why we'll still be here when species like yours have forgotten what honor means." Maya returned to her seat and sat down quietly, folding her hands in her lap as if nothing had happened. But the damage was done. Every student in the room was looking at Instructor Vextar with new eyes, seeing not a war hero but a broken being whose authority rested on lies. Vextar stood at the front of the empty classroom, his massive frame trembling with rage and humiliation. The small human had systematically destroyed his reputation with surgical precision, using his own words against him and exposing the cowardice he had spent years trying to hide. But what terrified him most was the realization that Maya had done it all while remaining perfectly calm, perfectly controlled. She hadn't raised her voice or shown anger. She had simply waited for the right moment and struck with devastating effectiveness. For the first time in his life, Vextar understood what it meant to be prey. She sat in silence at the back, until the instructor struck. Third document. The Academy's corridors buzzed with whispered conversations in the days following Maya's confrontation with Instructor Vextar. Word had spread through the student body with the speed that gossip always travels in closed communities. The story grew in the telling. Some versions had Maya exposing classified military secrets. Others claimed she had challenged Vextar to single combat. But the core truth remained. The quiet human in the back corner had somehow broken their instructor's confidence completely. Vextar himself had become a shadow of his former presence. He still arrived for classes on time, still activated the holographic displays and delivered his lectures, but the commanding authority that had defined him was gone. His voice lacked its former thunder. His predatory smile had been replaced by constant wariness, and his eyes rarely strayed from the front of the classroom. Maya continued her pattern of silent attention, taking notes and observing, but now her fellow students watched her with a mixture of respect and unease. They had witnessed something unprecedented, a human systematically dismantling a veteran warrior's reputation through nothing but careful observation and patient timing. Thorak, the four-armed Krex cadet, approached Maya after class one afternoon. His metallic skin gleamed under the corridor lighting as he matched her pace toward the dormitory section. "Cadet Chen," he said, his voice carrying the formal courtesy that his species used for potential threats. "Might I ask you something?" Maya looked up at him calmly. Even among the Krex, Thorak was considered large, standing nearly 2.5 meters tall with shoulders broad enough to fill a doorway. His species had evolved for heavy labor and construction work, developing 4 powerful arms and natural armor plating that could deflect small arms fire. "Of course," Maya replied. "How did you know about Instructor Vextar's service record? That information isn't available in the Academy databases." Maya was quiet for a moment, considering her response. They walked through a section of corridor lined with viewing ports that looked out onto the Academy's training grounds, where senior students practiced combat maneuvers in powered armor suits. "I made it my business to know," she said finally. Thorak's 4 hands clenched and unclenched nervously. "But why?" "Most students focus on learning from their instructors, not investigating them." Maya stopped walking and turned to face the towering Krex cadet. For a moment, she studied his expression, searching for something in his metallic features. "Tell me, Thorak," she said quietly, "what do you know about human history? Our evolution? Our development as a species?" The question seemed to surprise him. "The basic facts, I suppose. Your species evolved on a death world, survived through tool use and cooperation. You developed agriculture and technology relatively quickly compared to most species." "All true," Maya nodded, "but incomplete. Do you know what made Earth a death world?" Thorak's head tilted slightly, a gesture of confusion among his people. "Environmental factors, natural disasters, aggressive wildlife?" "All of those," Maya agreed. "But the worst predators on Earth weren't animals. They were other humans." She resumed walking, and Thorak followed, his heavy footsteps echoing in the corridor. "For most of our evolutionary history, the greatest threat to any human group was another human group. We developed in an environment where the most dangerous enemy always looked exactly like us." "I don't understand the relevance," Thorak said. "We learned to be very, very good at recognizing liars," Maya explained. "At detecting deception, at reading micro-expressions, at noticing when someone's story doesn't match their behavior. It was a survival skill. Groups that couldn't spot infiltrators or false allies were wiped out by groups that could." They passed a group of Etherian students practicing telepathic coordination, their translucent forms shimmering as they shared thoughts directly. Maya watched them for a moment before continuing. "Most species in the galaxy evolved with natural advantages: armor, weapons, telepathy, enhanced senses. But humans evolved the ability to see through deception. We became apex predators of social environments." Thorak was quiet for several steps, processing her words. "You're saying you identified Instructor Vextar as a threat?" "I identified him as someone whose public image didn't match his actual capabilities," Maya corrected. "Someone who had built his reputation on lies and half-truths. That made him dangerous in a different way." "Dangerous how?" Maya stopped again, turning to look directly at Thorak. "What happens when a military instructor teaches tactics based on false experiences? When students trust someone who has never actually faced the situations he claims to understand?" The implications hit Thorak like a physical blow. His forearms went rigid as he realized what Maya was suggesting. "You think he could get students killed?" "I think he's been teaching for 5 years based on a fabricated service record," Maya said bluntly. "I think there are Academy graduates serving on ships throughout the galaxy who learned tactics from someone who abandoned his post when faced with real combat." The corridor seemed to grow colder around them. Thorak stared down at the small human, his metallic features reflecting the lighting in harsh angles. "Why haven't you reported this to Academy administration?" Maya's expression softened slightly, showing something that might have been sadness. "Because exposing him wouldn't help the students he's already graduated. It would only destroy one being's life without saving anyone else." "Then why confront him at all?" "Because I wanted him to understand that his behavior was being watched. That there are consequences for teaching others to be cowards while pretending to be a hero." They had reached the dormitory section, where students from different species maintained their living spaces according to their biological needs. Thorak paused at the entrance to his quarters, but didn't activate the door controls. "Cadet Chen," he said slowly, "are all humans like you?" Maya tilted her head, genuinely curious. "What do you mean? Are you all so calculating? So patient in planning your responses?" Maya was quiet for a long moment, considering the question seriously. "We're persistent," she said finally. "When something matters to us, we don't give up easily, and we remember everything." With that, she walked away toward her own quarters, leaving Thorak to stand alone in the corridor. processing what he had learned about human nature. The confrontation that would change everything came 3 weeks later, during a practical combat exercise in the Academy's simulation chambers. The class had been divided into small teams to plan and execute an assault on a fortified position, using the Academy's advanced holographic systems to create a realistic battlefield environment. Maya found herself assigned to a team with 4 other students: Thorak the Krex, Lisa the Etherian, Zextak the Vorthak, and a Felinian named Resh, whose species resembled large bipedal cats with retractable claws and enhanced reflexes. The mix of abilities should have made them a formidable unit, but the exercise was proving more difficult than expected. The scenario placed them in command of an assault force tasked with capturing an enemy communications facility before reinforcements could arrive. The facility was heavily defended, surrounded by automated weapon systems and protected by natural barriers that limited approach routes. Instructor Vextar monitored their progress from the control room, his voice coming through their communication systems with increasingly harsh criticism. "Pathetic," he snarled as their second assault attempt failed. "You're thinking like Academy students, not warriors. Real combat doesn't give you time to debate every decision." Maya stood in the team's temporary command position, studying the holographic display that showed their target facility. Around her, her teammates argued about approach vectors and tactical priorities, their stress levels rising as Vextar's commentary grew more hostile. "We need to use Resh's speed advantage," Thorak insisted, pointing to a narrow canyon that led toward the facility's rear entrance. "Send him in fast. Disable their sensors before they can respond." "Too risky," Lisa countered, her telepathic abilities allowing her to sense the emotional state of their virtual enemies. "The defenders are expecting exactly that kind of approach. They'll be watching the obvious infiltration routes." Zextak clicked her mandibles in frustration, her hive mind connection giving her access to tactical databases that none of the others could match. "Standard doctrine suggests a frontal assault with heavy support, but our simulated forces lack the firepower for that approach." Maya listened to their debate while studying the tactical display, her eyes moving across terrain features and defensive positions with mechanical precision. She was running calculations in her head, considering variables that her teammates hadn't noticed. "Cadet Chen," Vextar's voice cut through their discussion like a blade. "You've been remarkably quiet during this exercise. Perhaps humans prefer to let others do the thinking in combat situations." The barb was clearly intended to provoke a response, but Maya's expression remained calm as she continued studying the display. Her teammates looked at her expectantly, waiting to see how she would respond to their instructor's challenge. "I'm analyzing the scenario parameters," Maya said simply. "Analyzing," Vexatar repeated mockingly. "While your teammates develop actual plans, you want to analyze. Tell me, Cadet, what brilliant insights has your analysis revealed?" Maya was quiet for another moment, her fingers tracing patterns across the holographic display as she highlighted specific features of the terrain. When she spoke, her voice was calm and professional. "The scenario is flawed. The statement hit the command center like a bomb. Even through the communication system, they could hear Vexatar's sharp intake of breath." Around Maya, her teammates stared at her in shock. No student had ever challenged the validity of an academy exercise. "Explain yourself," Vextar growled. Maya manipulated the display to show the facility's defensive positions in detail, highlighting weapon emplacements and sensor arrays. The defenders have positioned their automated systems to cover all standard approach routes, but they've left a critical vulnerability in their sensor network. She zoomed in on a section of the facility's perimeter where 2 sensor coverage areas overlapped incorrectly, creating a blind spot large enough for a small team to exploit. "This gap in coverage would never exist in a real facility," Maya continued. "Any competent engineer would have identified and corrected it during the design phase. The only way this vulnerability could exist is if someone wanted attackers to find it. Vexitar's voice came through the communication system with forced casualness. And what would you conclude from that observation, Cadet? I conclude that this isn't a tactical exercise, Maya replied. It's a psychological evaluation. You want to see which students will take the obvious bait and which ones will recognize the trap. The silence that followed was deafening. In the control room, Vexitar stared at the monitoring displays, realizing that the quiet human had seen through his carefully constructed scenario with embarrassing ease. He had indeed planted the sensor gap as a test, expecting students to either miss it entirely or rush blindly into what was actually a kill zone. Interesting theory, Vexitar said finally. But academic analysis doesn't win battles. If this were real combat, your enemies wouldn't wait for you to finish thinking. If this were real combat, Maya said quietly, I would already have won. The statement was delivered with such calm confidence that it sent a chill through everyone listening. Vexitar's composure finally cracked completely. Really? He snarled, his voice rising to a roar. Then perhaps you'd like to demonstrate your superior understanding of combat, Cadet Chen? Maya looked up at the communication sensor, knowing that Vexitar was watching her through the monitoring system. Are you challenging me to single combat? Instructor? The question hung in the air like an exposed nerve. Single combat challenges between students and instructors were technically allowed under academy regulations, but they were extremely rare. For an instructor to issue such a challenge was essentially an admission that he had lost control of his classroom. I'm offering you a chance to prove your theories, Vexitar replied, though his voice carried more anger than confidence. Combat simulation, one-on-one. We'll see how your human analysis holds up against real military experience. Maya's teammates looked at her with expressions ranging from admiration to horror. Challenging an instructor to single combat was either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid, and none of them were sure which. I accept, Maya said simply. 30 minutes later, Maya stood alone in Combat Simulation Chamber 7, her body encased in the Academy's standard training armor. The suit was designed to simulate real combat conditions while preventing actual injury, using force feedback and neural interfaces to create the sensation of being hit without causing permanent damage. Around her, the chamber's holographic systems had created a simple arena, a circular space 50 meters across, with scattered obstacles providing limited cover. The environment was neutral, giving neither combatant an advantage based on their species' natural preferences. Instructor Vexitar entered from the opposite side of the arena, his massive form made even more imposing by the heavy combat armor designed for his species. The Draknari suit enhanced his natural strength and speed while providing additional protection for his vital organs. Against Maya's smaller human frame, he looked like a tank facing a bicycle. Last chance to withdraw, Cadet. Vexitar's voice came through the communication system, distorted slightly by his armor's vocal processors. I have no desire to humiliate a student, even one as arrogant as yourself. Maya checked her armor's systems one final time, ensuring that all sensors and movement interfaces were properly calibrated. I appreciate your concern, Instructor, but I think you'll find that humans are harder to beat than you expect. The chamber's control system announced the beginning of the combat simulation, and both combatants activated their weapons. Vexitar carried a plasma rifle designed for his species' four-armed physiology, while Maya held a standard human assault weapon that looked absurdly small in comparison. For the first few moments, they circled each other cautiously, each waiting for the other to make the first move. Vexitar had significant advantages in strength, speed, and firepower, but Maya's smaller size made her a more difficult target. Tell me, Cadet, Vexitar called out as they maneuvered around the arena's obstacles, what does your superior analysis suggest about our current tactical situation? Maya ducked behind a barrier as his plasma fire scorched the air where her head had been. It suggests that you're trying to provoke me into making a mistake. Smart girl, Vextar growled, advancing steadily toward her position. But intelligence won't save you when I reach your hiding spot. Maya rolled to new cover as Vextar's plasma rifle reduced her previous position to molten slag. His rate of fire was impressive, and his accuracy was better than she had expected. But she had noticed something important. He was firing in patterns, using suppression tactics designed for battlefield conditions rather than arena combat. "Instructor," she called out, her voice calm despite the energy blasts flying around her. "Can I ask you something?" "Talk quickly," Vextar replied, reloading his weapon while advancing. "You don't have much time left. During your service with Admiral Technor, did you ever actually engage in ground combat? Or were your duties primarily administrative?" The question hit Vextar like a physical blow, causing him to pause in his advance. Maya used that moment of hesitation to sprint to a new position, putting more distance between them. "I served in multiple capacities," Vextar said, but his voice lacked conviction. "I'm sure you did," Maya replied, and something in her tone made Vexatar's blood run cold. "But I'm curious about your actual combat experience, because your tactics suggest someone who learned warfare from textbooks rather than battlefields." Vexatar's roar of rage echoed through the arena as he abandoned his careful approach and charged directly toward Maya's position. It was exactly the reaction she had been waiting for. As the massive Draknari rounded the obstacle that had been shielding her, he found empty air. Maya had anticipated his emotional response and moved to a flanking position, using his own momentum against him. Her first shot caught him in the back armor, sending feedback through his nervous system that simulated a disabling injury. The second shot hit his weapon, triggering a system shutdown that left him effectively disarmed. Vextar spun around to face her, his yellow eyes wide with shock and fury. "Impossible!" he snarled. "You're just a human!" Maya kept her weapon trained on him while maintaining a safe distance. "Just a human," she agreed calmly. "But a human who understands that real combat isn't about strength or intimidation. It's about patience, observation, and waiting for your opponent to make a mistake." The simulation ended with the chamber's control system declaring Maya the victor. As the holographic arena faded around them, Vextar stood frozen in his armor, staring at the small human who had just systematically destroyed his reputation for the second time in a month. "How?" he whispered, his voice barely audible through his armor's speakers. Maya began removing her combat suit, her movements efficient and practiced. "You fought like someone who had never actually been in a real firefight," she explained matter-of-factly. "Your tactics were textbook perfect, but they had no flexibility. When I provoked an emotional response, you abandoned strategy in favor of aggression." She paused in her equipment removal to look directly at him. A real veteran would have recognized the psychological manipulation and maintained discipline. But you reacted exactly like someone whose combat experience came from simulations rather than actual warfare. The truth hit Vextar like a collapsing star. Everything Maya had said about him was correct. He was a fraud who had built his reputation on lies and half-truths. He had never been in real combat, never faced an enemy who could actually kill him, never made the life-or-death decisions that defined true warriors. And now a human student, a representative of the species he had spent months mocking, had exposed his cowardice in front of the entire academy. "Why?" he asked, his voice hollow with defeat. "Why did you do this to me?" Maya finished removing her armor and turned to face him fully. For the first time since their classes began, her expression showed something other than calm neutrality. There was sadness in her eyes and perhaps a touch of pity. "Because someone had to," she said quietly. "You were teaching future officers to be cowards while pretending to be a hero." How many students would have died because they trusted your fake expertise? How many ships would have been lost because their commanders learned tactics from someone who had never actually used them? She walked toward the chamber's exit, but paused at the threshold to deliver her final words. The galaxy is a dangerous place, Instructor. It's full of real predators and real warriors who won't hesitate to destroy anyone who gets in their way. If you want to survive out there, you need to understand something important about humans. Vextar looked up at her, his predatory eyes now filled with something closer to fear than anger. We don't just adapt to dangerous environments, Maya said softly. We become the most dangerous thing in them. That's how we survived long enough to reach the stars. That's why every species that tries to conquer us learns the same lesson eventually. She stepped through the chamber's exit, her footsteps echoing in the corridor beyond. Behind her, Instructor Vexitar stood alone in the empty simulation chamber, finally understanding why humans were respected and feared throughout the galaxy. They weren't the strongest species, or the fastest, or the most naturally gifted. But they were patient, observant, and utterly ruthless when protecting the things they cared about. They were apex predators disguised as harmless prey, and anyone who underestimated them did so at their own peril. Maya Chen had sat in silence at the back of the classroom for weeks, watching and waiting for the right moment to strike. When that moment came, she had destroyed her opponent with surgical precision, using nothing but words and careful timing. It was, Vextar realized, the most human thing he had ever witnessed, and it terrified him more than any monster he could imagine.